I'm going to turn the floor over to Earl Schwartz. Welcome back. Thank you again for doing this, and thank you to the foundation for making it possible.
Thank you. And I am also delighted that Nina's here with me today, and I thought that I'd begin by sharing a passage from the traditional Jewish wedding liturgy. As part of the liturgy, God is alluded to as the original matchmaker. And there are a series of benedictions that accompany the wedding, and one of them reads, Sameach tesamach re'im ha'ahavim. Be so happy, you beloved companions, as your Creator made you happy in the Garden of Eden long ago. So there is my Garden of Eden. I'm delighted that she's here today. Thank you again to the foundation. I'm going to briefly review what we've done the last few weeks and then ask if there are any questions before I go on. We began with some general observations about books, the oral roots of Hebrew Bible, the ways in which that oral origin for much of what we have today in written form should be kept in mind in thinking through the way in which Bible attempts to convey what it is saying. We talked a little bit about the Hebrew language, the peculiarities, the distinctive qualities of the Hebrew language. And last week we began to apply that introductory material to the first two chapters of Genesis. We talked about the unique function of the verb that has the root bet, resh, aleph, ra, and the glottal stop, which describes whatever it is that begins this all for us at what we call in English creation, but for which we have no analogous term in Hebrew, only that it is that thing which, whatever it is the thing that God does that we don't. And that's how the story begins. We also talked about good and goodness. We looked at three applications of good and goodness in the opening verses of Genesis. First, the first absence of good in the patterned repetition of saw that it was good, which we suggested might have something to do with the fact that it would appear that on the second day God's work is not complete until the third, and so the goodness that one would have expected at the end of the second day is delayed until the third. That somehow goodness in these passages has something to do with wholeness, completeness, ready to work. The first very good, which comes at the end of the sixth day of creation, which we suggested had something to do with a composite or collective wholeness, a larger wholeness. And finally, the first not good. Not good that a human being be alone. And we pointed out that it's striking that in these opening verses of Genesis, the first not good doesn't have to do with any of the categories that we might immediately think of as being associated in a biblical sense with what goes wrong in the world. Not sin, not Satan, but aloneness, being abandoned, being separated, the terrible separateness that Tillich emphasizes, for example, in his work. And I left you last time by saying that we were going to talk a little bit more about gender. We began to explore gender last week. We looked at chapter 2, verse 18 in some detail. We talked about the Hebrew root ayin, zayin, resh, ezer, the term that's commonly translated in English as helper. I noted that we can tell from all of the ways in which that root appears in biblical names connected to God that it cannot possibly mean, as it may typically mean in English, that a helper is a subordinate member of a pair, that at the very least we have to assume that the helper has a power, has a quality that the helped does not have, and that in the case of God as my helper, Azariel, El-Azar, Azariah, all of those names that use that root. We're talking about something that perhaps is best understood as describing the superior or the dominant member of the pair. And in fact, if we begin with that presumption, that in the second chapter of Genesis, the gendering of human beings begins with the supposition that the female, once we have two genders, that the female is the dominant member of the pair, is much more consistent with what follows. I pointed out, for example, that in Genesis 2:25, we're told, right before we return to Eden and the snake, that's why a man leaves his parents and clings to his woman, not the other way around, which once again suggests female dominance. And finally, the fact that the story is driven through the third chapter of Genesis by the actions of the woman, not by the actions of the man, would suggest that, at least initially, we have an interesting counterpoint to the verse with which the consequences for what occurs in Genesis come to rest on the genders, and we'll come back to that in a moment, what that may have to do with the implications for gender leaving Eden, which may not have been the case when the human beings entered. So, having said that, I promised we were going to talk a little bit more about gender today and nakedness, and I can't let you down. So, any questions or comments? Any questions or comments before we move on? Yes, please.
No,
What?
I'm not going to ask you for the history of religion sort of lecture on this thing, but might any of this gender business be reflective of some sort of matriarchal context in which early narrations began?
It at least, I think, Dwight, suggests the ease with which in antiquity that might have seemed likely. Let's say that much. That the ancient world, yeah, contrary to our common presumptions about gender in antiquity, it might very well have seemed far more likely to an ancient Israelite that things began with a female-dominated world than we might suppose. And perhaps from observation of other aspects of the world around them, perhaps from reflection, personal experience. But at any rate, I think that it seems fair enough to conclude that it was quite plausible to an ancient hearer of the Bible. Okay. Thank you. Now, yes, please.
Just at the side comment, maybe I'm wrong about this, but do you understand that still today, authentic membership in the Jewish community of Israel
Is matrilineal, yeah. The traditional method of identifying Jewish identity by birth is matrilineal. Now, it's a complicated matter, and it may simply have been a result of historical circumstance. That's true, and the fact that it was acceptable and persisted uninterrupted for a couple thousand years, at least is further indication that it didn't seem utterly implausible to the Jewish people that primary identity was inherited matrilineally. Yes? Anything else? Yes, please. One more.
I'm intrigued by the not good
Yes.
thing. And so I've been ruminating on that.
Yes.
Maybe you could straighten me out. Here's where it is two things. In the story, the second story, man comes first. Kind of. The Dostans over, and then now, help me out, man. Name these things.
Yes.
So I'm tying that into this not good thing. I didn't get it totally right. I got to fix it.
Yes. Yes.
And there's kind of a suggestion there that when you see something that's not exactly right, maybe you ought to fix it too.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. So the first question about gender. It's tricky, and we're going to go right to this in just a second. But the Hebrew word for human is grammatically a masculine noun. So when you use that word, Adam, or ha-Adam, when you use the definitive article with it, has a masculine grammatical function. It lends the term an aura of masculinity. But ha-Adam, the man, is a non-gendered identity. It's gendered grammatically, but it's not gendered in person. And by that I mean, until the conclusion of the passage, we don't get the true gendered terms in Hebrew, which are ish and isha. When there are two possibilities, one of them says, now I see you're an isha because you came from an ish and we have gender. But the human in 2:18, although surrounded by masculine sensibilities, is in fact a non-gendered reality. And that's what we're going to talk about a little more in a moment. It doesn't happen in English because we've dropped gendered nouns in that way, right? Man is gendered because it refers to a kind of person, but it's not gendered grammatically. But Hebrew complicates that problem. In terms of the second issue, we're going to talk about, at some length today, the degree to which the divine name used for the first time in chapter 2 of Genesis, not used in chapter 1 to describe the Creator, the divine proper name of this God, is ever after associated with a kind of intimacy and caring concern that allows this aspect of the narrative, as it touches on God's purposes, to learn. This God that we meet by the divine name in chapter 2 does indeed learn, much to this God's sorrow, through the first 11 chapters of the book. And it's only by the time you get to chapter 12 that this God is ready to begin the story of Israel. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's just the way the book works, as we were talking about it last week. It begins with creation, and then finally we get to the story of Israel. But as I mentioned last week, and I'll just say again, to ancient Jewish readers, that was not obvious. There was no obvious reason to begin the covenantal history of the people of Israel, because that's what they understood the Bible to be, with creation. There was no special reason it had to start there, just as Matthew knew there was no special reason to start Jesus' genealogy with the first human being. Rather, it starts with Abraham because Matthew says this remains a story about the covenantal history of Israel. That being the case, one of the ways you can understand the function of these first 11 chapters of Genesis is it takes 11 chapters for this God, in this intimate aspect, the God who really wants to be with human beings, to figure out how that's going to happen. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, as I said, we began last time with some initial observations about gender, and then a cryptic comment about nakedness. Those were great questions, by the way. Thank you. I want to continue to talk about both of these topics to begin with this morning, beginning with gender. But I also want to reassure you that when we do get to nakedness, which we will, we are not going to explore the theme in a biblically Hebrew sort of way. Now, you remember that I have emphasized for 3 weeks now that biblical Hebrew is dominated by verbs of action. Remember the story of Bella the fire toad, that unless it moved, unless it was realized, unless it was actualized in discernible activity, it wasn't fully real to the biblical writer. So what I'm trying to say is despite the grave misgivings that the Hebrew Bible has about human imagination, as an alternative to realized action, and those misgivings are serious, I'm going to assume that in this case, when we start to talk about nakedness, imagination is preferable.
I'm not in it.
The narrator of Genesis 1:26 through 28 has a problem. This is the other place in which we learn about gender, both in the first version of the creation and in the second version, chapter 1 through 2:3, and then again 2:4 through the story of Eden. We have the treatment of gender. We've talked about the second version of how human beings become gendered. I want to say a word about the first version now. So if you take a look at that with me. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. I'm going to read the verse to you in its full convoluted complexity. Because what we want to explore for a few minutes this morning, I think, is what that complexity tells us, first of all, about why it's a problem to say what these opening chapters are trying to say with words. Now that may seem an impossible contradiction, to say what you want to say in these opening chapters with words. But it's not a contradiction in a biblical context, where biblical writers are acutely aware of what they cannot but must nevertheless attempt to say. Biblical writers are constantly aware of, let me say it again, what they cannot but nevertheless must attempt to say. It's a problem that permeates the Bible, especially when these writers are talking about God, but also when they attempt to talk about something like God's image. So here's the problem. Then God said, verse 26, "Let us make human in our image as we are formed. And this one will rule or have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and the animals over all the earth, all that are creeping creepers on the earth." Then God created, whatever that means, the human being in his image. Now that should be enough. But the verse goes on. In the image of God created him. That should be enough. Then the verse goes on. Male and female created them. What's the problem? Well, it has to do with this. The word Adam, as I said a moment ago, without the article, is a masculine singular. Adam, human. Human, one and many. There can be one Adam, but there is also Adam as human, humanity. Male and female, and ha-Adam is a singular masculine word which is attempting to convey what it means to be in the image of a God who is identified in this same verse by a plural. So you have a train crash of grammar. You really do. You really do. So you have, first of all, you have Elohim. This is generic God in Hebrew. Sometimes it refers to the God of Israel. Sometimes it refers to any other God. But in fact, this part, the suffix, is a plain old masculine plural. So it's a plural word. In the Hebrew Bible, whenever it refers to someone else's God, the verb is also plural, or the adjective. When it refers to the God of Israel, the verb is singular. So you have, first of all, in this verse, a singular verb followed by a plural. And if you had just read the first 25 verses of Genesis and had never seen this book before, never heard a story like this, every time the narrator says this, and the narrator has said it about 15 times already, then God created, then God made, singular verb, plural subject. You're not only asking, why is it a plural if we're talking about a singular God? You're asking, why is a plural getting a singular verb? It's language that cannot effectively convey what the narrator's trying to say, but must somehow say. So you have this first problem. The generic God word is a plural that takes, when it's speaking about the God of Israel, a singular verb. Then you have the mysterious, let us make as our image in our form. I'm not even going to talk about image and form. We're going to leave that conversation aside. There is, however, the problem, obviously, of us. Now, who would us be, except that this is already a plural. So there's already an us involved in this. You don't need another us to make it problematic. Then there's the problem that this plural God singular action says, in his image. His image. So now we have a plural with a singular image, and it's masculine. In his image. But we're making an Adam, a human being, which is singular, plural, masculine, and feminine. The language won't let you say this without a fight. So the narrator then says, here's what I mean. I mean, in the image of God created him. Now, how does that second version alter or supplement the first? So let's look at this closely. Then God created the human in his image. And then the narrator says, that is to say, in the image of God created him. What's happened to the him? What's the first him? First him refers to in his image. That seems to refer to God. It could refer to the human being, and then we'd have an entirely different verse. But let's say, as is the convention, it refers to God. So the first time around, God creates the human being in his image. What's the problem? What's the grammatical problem? Well, it suggests that we now know something about God, which the narrator doesn't want us to conclude, which is
Male and singular.
or that God is masculine. Yes, that God has a masculine image, because then you can't create the human in God's image, because the human has at least two genders, right? So, first the narrator says, then God created him in his image. And then the narrator says, no, you have to keep in mind that is in the image of God, which gets rid of the masculine pronoun for God, but does reintroduce the plural. In the image of God, he created him. So now we've moved the his to him. But who's the him now? The human. But that still won't work. Why won't that work? Because the word human is masculine grammatically, but the person human isn't masculine collectively. So it can't be his image, because we're talking about at least two genders. So then the narrator says, what I really want you to keep in mind is not only his image, who is not a he, his image, who is not a we, but male and female created them. So the third time around, we have two genders, we have the plural pronoun. Why didn't we have the plural pronoun the first time?
Because it was referring to one humanity.
Right, and one
God.
One God, right. So, even though the word is plural. So, what you have here is a perfect example, and I think it's pretty transparent, of what can go wrong when you try to say something important in words. And that's why, as members of biblical faith, we try and say what's important in other ways besides words. The fact is that this narrator is almost certainly struggling primarily against the strictures of the language. The narrator wants to say humanity, gendered humanity, single God, God without gender, and related through this mysterious notion of image. And there's no good language for saying that clearly and concisely. The best this narrator can do is 3 permutations. Put them together, and you get something like what the narrator is trying to say. A single, gendered humanity, male and female, one and many, in the image of a single God, identified as a plural.
After daylight savings time?
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, Dwight, you're right. But at the very least, if it leaves you confused, that's also good. Because the most important thing to keep in mind, I think, is the sobering and, for me, the humbling realization that this record is self-consciously concerned about the limits of its own language. Isn't that an important thing to keep in mind? That this is a narration constructed by narrators who already are concerned lest the loose use of common language have grossly negative consequences for those who misunderstand. Okay. That difficulty that we've just described would seem to explain why the narrator has to describe the human as in the divine image 3 times. As I said a moment ago, the passage doesn't offer a clear explanation for why human beings have been created this way. But after a while, we'll get used to that why not being explicit in the text. Almost every important why in the Hebrew Bible, as we said in our first conversation a couple weeks ago, is left for the consideration of the listener, first of all, before any kind of explicit confirmation is provided. It's far more powerful to say, you tell me why, than to tell you why. And this is an early example of that. It's just so inviting to say, and why would God choose to do just that? At any rate, no explanation, including the meaning of image or form, nor why God may apparently create an image of God, but we may not make one. Why would that be true? That God immediately violates what's going to be a central premise of later Israelite culture. God makes images, but we cannot. And the only purpose we're left to conclude in this first creation narrative, human beings are created for, is to exercise their authority over the rest of creation. That's what we're concluding. While the second chapter of Genesis provides a somewhat different answer for why humans, along with a commentary on why gendered, as we've seen. very interesting, very subtle, and some would suggest very important complementary views of what it means to be human. In the second chapter, human beings are explicitly created to take care of the garden, the Shomra Ula Ogda, to protect it and to serve it or to work it, along with the commentary on why gender. It's not good for human beings to be alone. Let me say, before we move on to chapter 3, that it's often noted that the term used for the Creator in these opening passages of Genesis, as I suggested a few minutes ago, is different. The Creator is consistently identified in the first chapter of Genesis with this word, Elohim, which is, in Hebrew, the generic common term for a divine person, Elohim in the plural. Even to say an Elohim in English is a contradiction. An Elohim. While in chapter 2 and chapter 3 of Genesis, the God who creates and the God who interacts intimately with human beings in Eden is identified by the proper name that the Israelites used, the name that was for the most part left unpronounced in post-biblical Jewish cultures to this day. The proper name of God followed in construct form that name Elohim, that is to say, this proper name who is Elohim. Two different names for the Creator in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. And that distinction has played a very important role, as I know many of you know, in historical critical theory. It's commonly assumed that Genesis 1 uses a distinct name because it was the commonly used name of God, commonly used term among some Israelites at a certain time in the development of Israelite culture, whereas the proper name that appears in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 for God was a proper name used by other Israelites at other times and other places in Israelite history, and that eventually the two narratives were joined. We've talked about why I believe the joining of the narratives was done very delicately, very carefully, that we don't have patchwork here, we have quilt work. And the intersection is meaningful in and of itself. I just want to add one more point. That even if we are not all that concerned with this historical critical issue, the possibility that we have two separate narrative traditions that flow together at some point as part of a larger editorial process, it's still worth noting that it's long been observed that the use of the proper name of God, the so-called 4-letter name, the Tetragrammaton, that proper name of God typically comes in texts in which the personhood of God is more clearly portrayed. God emerges as an interacting, dialogical person, along with greater intimacy between God and the human. And this God person seeks out great intimacy with humans. Whereas the generic Elohim, as in the first chapter of Genesis, appears in passages in which the emphasis is primarily on the power, the dominion of a God, what it means to be divine. This God, any God, real or presumed. And that might help to explain why, in the first chapter of Genesis, the human beings are given the only purpose, which is human beings created in this image, which is, once they're blessed with the power to reproduce, to exercise their authority. If that's what the image had something to do with initially, we're not surprised that God, referred to this way, which commonly is associated, carries overtones of authority, dominion, Elohim, divine per se, would come to be associated with human beings who reflect that quality in their dominion over creation, like their Creator. But before we go on to a more careful examination of the next 2 chapters of Genesis, I want to point out one more very subtle and significant feature of the first chapter. Before I do, any questions or comments? Please, yes?
Do you think that the characteristics of Hebrew grammar
Yes,
and style, which
Yeah.
you have been emphasizing,
yes.
are part of the divine revelation?
How do I do this without being presumptuous?
Welcome to Lutheranism.
Here's what I would say. I think it's not surprising that the fiercest manifestations of a clear embrace of the utterly and completely incomprehensible nature of God as God comes from Islam and Jewish tradition. And that the language shaped human reflection on the world in such a way as to make it possible to say, I only conceive of God's presence, I cannot conceive of God's nature. The language helped lead toward that conclusion. I think that's fair enough to say. That if we were talking about a culture that emerged with, say, verbs of being, the idea of God's presence could have been displaced to some degree, as in some medieval Jewish and Christian and Muslim revisions of biblical faith. Displaced by the notion that God is a being, first of all, and that that being is discernible and analytically accessible. That that's what theology is about. I think that that requires a different kind of language, and it's no accident that Islam and biblical tradition, Hebrew Bible tradition, begins by precluding that possibility. The language didn't allow it. Does that make sense?
I thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, but not now.
Good. If I could just say Augustine's famous prayer. Reminds you of Augustine's famous prayer?
Yes.
God make me holy, but not quite yet.
Well, I will ask, but to create us a framework for understanding the J and the E
Yes,
traditions.
yes.
But you also, by comments, opened up, but didn't give us a framework for how these texts would be understood, as they sometimes are in the history of religions, between the telluric, earth mother religions and the sky-oriented or masculine. I mean, a number of your comments fit right in there. Could
Yes.
you give us a framework for that as well?
I think it's intriguing. I think it's intriguing to consider the possibility that gender, in fact, did adhere to the terminology. But I think it's complicated. I'll tell you why. There are moments in which feminine verbs are used to describe divine actions. But there's no consistency in the use of those verbs. So, the Spirit, or the wind of God, in the opening verse of Genesis, or the second verse, depending on how you parse the verse, is a feminine action. That hovering is in Hebrew, because wind or spirit is a feminine noun. That hovering, that first action of God, takes a feminine verb. That's an Elohim text. On the other hand, there are other passages in the Song of Moses, I believe. God is described as hovering over the nest of the nestlings and ruffling it, and the verb used there is also feminine. The Song of Moses is in divine J name. So it's inconsistent. I think that it's worth considering that gendering is in fact part of biblical tradition, despite the disconcerting implications that at least the editor of chapter 1, verse 26 saw in that possibility, if only in folk traditions of the people. But I think it's a complicated story. I'm not sure that it's a consistent story. You're welcome. You're welcome. I want to talk about, for just a moment, the blessing of the animals versus the blessing of the human beings. This is the last observation that I'd like to make about Genesis chapter 1. The first blessing of animals comes in verse 22. It follows the creation of sea creatures, sky creatures, and creepy creatures. Those three types of living creatures. It's the first reference to blessing. By and large, in the Hebrew Bible, blessing, which comes from this root, root sign around it, blessing
Barak.
refers to fecundity, life force, the capacity to endure. It's a very visceral, very earthy, very concrete expression of something having to do with ongoing fertility, reproduction, and the power to sustain. That's why it's related to rain, it's related to birth directly. Blessing is to have children. When the patriarchs bless their kids, they don't say, I hope you get a good education, I hope you get a good job, I hope you're happy. They don't say that. They say, have lots and lots of babies, lots of babies. Blessings of the breast and blessings of the womb, blessings of your crops, blessings of your flocks. It's about the immediate, practical, discernible presence of the divine life force in your world. That's blessing. So, in verse 22, then God blessed them. Quote, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters in the sea, and the sky, and birds multiply through the sky. Here's the comparable blessing in verse 28 for humans. Then God blessed them and said to them, God, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Before we go on to the specific function that follows be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which is essentially exactly like the blessing for the animals. What's the only other difference? If you look at those two texts, there's one small difference before you even get to the clause about dominion between the blessing for the humans and the blessing for the animals. What is it? It's really small. It would seem totally inconsequential.
There's no location.
There's
No location.
There's no,
Location.
meaning,
Well, the earlier verse says, fill the waters in the seas.
oh, I see. They have a place. Oh, that's interesting. They have a place where the blessing occurs. I wasn't thinking of that. That's an interesting idea. And stay there is the implication. That's wonderful. That's where you belong. That's true. I wasn't thinking of that, though. Do you see anything else? That was great. Before you get to subdue, before you get to that peculiar human function, which seems to be a reflex of the divine dominance.
In the first bit.
Yes, Pastor.
Well, is it God said to them?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the difference. God said to them. So if you look at it again, verse 22 is, then God blessed them, quote, here's the blessing. Verse 28, then God blessed them and said to them, God, be fruitful and multiply. And what might that be about? What's the difference between then God blessed them and then God blessed them and said to them? It implies relationship, and what does it imply about the blessing itself? That this is bestowed upon you through relationship. It's not like rain on your back. It's not like a spell. What is it?
Consciousness.
Yes.
That you're conscious of.
Yes. And is that a blessing in this case? What is the nature of this blessing, actually? What is God telling us to do? What's the blessing of, yes?
The dominion is to be in relationship to God, not something that's on our own, but it's in that.
Yes, in this case, but what makes it problematic? What is this about, this relationship context? It's about,
Choice.
about what?
Responsibility. Image.
About
Whether
what?
to follow the blessing or not.
Action,
About
action.
what action?
Sex.
It's about sex. Yes, it's about sex. Yes, yes, it is. So, yeah, sex. Okay. That's why I said, Connie, is that a blessing? That in the human's case, it's a matter of consciousness. Now, why would I ask? What's the difference? Everyone else gets it as a matter, one might say, of pure, unadulterated grace. That's some mixed metaphor. Pure, unadulterated grace. In the human being, and the human being apparently alone, it has to go through the, what did Freud say? Yes. What did Freud say was the strongest sexual organ of all?
Mind.
It has to go through that. The fact that this is placed in relationship, and not only in the lateral relationship of the partnership, but in the triangular relationship between me, my partner, and God, this, of all things, the first thing God has to say to us, has very, very profound implications. I've been reading Temple Grandin's book, Animals in Translation, and there's a passage in here that struck me as relevant to this point, and I just want to read it to you. She's talking about animal feelings. Short passage. Another big difference between animals and people is that animals probably don't have the complex emotions people do, like shame, guilt, embarrassment, greed, or wanting bad things to happen to people who are more successful than you. There are different schools of thought about simple and complex emotions, but the definition I use is brain-based. Simple emotions are the primary emotions, such as fear and rage, that come from the reptilian and the mammalian brains. So far, so good. Blessing pertains to animals as it pertains to human beings in a similar way, to the extent that we are reptilian and or mammalian as they are. Complex emotions, or secondary emotions, also come from the reptilian and the mammalian brains, but they light up the neocortex as well. These secondary emotions, as she refers to them, are routed through the front of the head, through the thinking part of the head, on the way out. The secondary emotions build on the primary emotions and involve more thought and interpretation. For instance, shame, guilt, and embarrassment probably all come out of the same primary emotion of separation distress, which I'll talk about shortly, she says. Your culture and upbringing teach you when to feel shame versus when to feel embarrassment or guilt, but all three start out in the brain as the pain of being isolated. over the human life where our sexuality didn't go through our brains? Or is it ultimately the other way around? What does it mean? The first thing that God provides us with in dialogical context is, for you and you alone, these things are not only a matter of feeling, they must necessarily be a matter of fact. And what a tangled and complicated legacy that becomes. What an interesting, subtle distinction, which is rooted in the biblical text, I think, quite clearly in a preposition. One short preposition. Okay. Before we go today, I promised.
But it's all downhill after sex.
Well, no, we're getting to nakedness. Have hope. Live in your hope, wife. Embrace it. Verse 25. Verse 25. So the two of them were Arumim. Arumim. So the two of them, oh, here you see the plural again. The two of them, meaning now the gendered human beings, were Arumim. Almost always, as I would guess in your text, translated as naked. The two of them were naked. Ha'adam ve'ishto, the human and his woman, interestingly enough. Once we learn the gender, in this case the gender pair is violated. Now we have the human and his woman, and we're left to wonder, why would the narrator revert to the human at this point? V'lo yitboshashu. The last word in the verse is obscure. It's typically translated as, but we're not ashamed. But that's not a sure deal. It was so obscure that already by New Testament times, many a Jewish commentator had no idea what that word meant. The convention has been that it means embarrassed, but it's not at all clear that it means embarrassed, or that if it means embarrassed, it comes immediately with the sort of connotations that we attribute to embarrassment or shame. But the interesting thing is that the very next verse uses the same word. Then the snake, who was more arum, the identical word, the only thing that changes is even more arum than any other creature of the field, which God, this God, proper name, generic Elohim, had made, says to the woman. And the next word is a kind of an elliptical word. It's the kind of word that you use in the middle of a sentence, as if you're already in a conversation, but the conversation hasn't started. It's the kind of word you use as if to imply we're talking here, but you really haven't initiated anything. It's a wedge in. So, it's that kind of so, but there's nothing before it, right? So, as we were saying, so, God told you that you can't eat any of the fruit, from any of the trees of the garden. So, let me go back for a moment and say that the similarity has long been noted. The fact that our Bibles today divide chapter 2, verse 25 from chapter 3, verse 1 is unrelated to the original construction of the text. The chapter divisions were done by an Archbishop of Canterbury about 800 years ago. The text had already existed for millennia before that happened. So you can just ignore the chapter division. This is one running text. 225 is in the same story as chapter 3, verse 1. And with the same word in 225 and 3:1, we are left to conclude that it's almost certainly intended as a pun. Now, whether the same word is actually being used in verse 225 and 3:1, or we have false cognates, makes no difference. What would a false cognate mean? False cognate is, it's not really the same word, it just sounds like the same word. It's like lead and lead, led the metal and led the horse. It doesn't make any difference with a pun. Biblical scholars often say, well, it's not the same word. Well, that's ridiculous. If you're I'm sorry. Modesty. If you're making a pun and it's oral, you're narrating, it doesn't make any difference whether it's the same word or it's a false cognate. It all has to do with the sound. The pun is the point. Somehow we're being led to consider what exactly it might mean to make this association between the human beings and the snake. Now what's intriguing, as I began to point out last week, is, can human beings be naked? Yes. Can human beings be shrewd or sly or any of the other words used to translate the same word in 3:1? Yes, that's clear enough. Can a snake be shrewd or sly? I suppose. Can a snake be naked, as we pointed out last week? Snakes shed their skin. They really can be naked. And even without shedding their skin, they have no pelt. So they're naked animals. The fact that this pun seems to be embedded in a very real ambiguity to begin with makes it all the more intriguing. But who's who in this pun? Who's the naked one and who's the shrewd one? That's the significance of the ambiguity. What follows might give us some insight. Let's just go a few words further before we close today. We'll pick up with this question of human naked shrewdness next time, but the snake asks a simple question, or in fact makes a statement that appears to be in the form of a question. So, God said you can't, and imagine the intonation, God said you can't eat from the trees of the garden? To which the woman replies to the snake, we can eat from the trees of the garden. It's from the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, don't eat it, don't even touch it. For at least 2,000 years, Jewish biblical commentators have said, and there is the pivot of the story. What did the woman just say? God said, you can eat, just not from the one in the middle of the garden. You can't even touch it. Where did God say that?
The touching? You did?
Yeah, the touching thing. No.
Nothing.
Nowhere. What are commentators intrigued by in the fact that in speaking with the snake, this human appears to elaborate on the restrictions relating to this special tree? Why is that interesting?
Well, the snakes are so kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, what does it suggest? Let's presume that the purpose of this narrative is in fact to suggest that the woman is making this up. Why would she make it up? Why would she make up an additional restriction? Why do we do that?
Put temptation farther away.
Supposedly it does. So here's a famous early rabbinic midrash on the story. Can't touch it, huh? So the snake pushes her into the tree, she touches it and says, I guess God was wrong. Does that sound human? How does that work? With a cigarette or a relationship. And then what do we do in our nakedness and our shrewdness? Well, let me just tell you where we'll pick up next time is, before long, we have human beings covering up and hiding and deflecting responsibility. And if that's not true, I don't know what. So that's where we're going to pick up next time. And we'll conclude with a conversation about the children of the first floor. Thanks, everyone.
I don't know